where the tide once fell silent. It began with the letter, plain, cream-colored paper, tucked without ceremony under the door of a quiet apartment at the edge of the city. No return address, no signature, only a few lines scrawled in hurried ink that had bled slightly into the fibers. And yet, it was enough to stir a life from its long, self-imposed stillness. The late autumn air outside clung heavy to the windows, leaving faint ghost breaths on the glass whenever someone passed too close. Street lamps flickered earlier now, their yellow lights stretching long shadows across wet pavement, like the city itself was leaning closer, eavesdropping on the lives within. Somewhere far below, a bus hissed to a stop, and the slow shuffle of weary commuters echoed in the damp inside. The room smelled faintly of paper and stale coffee, remnants of mornings that had passed without remark. A stack of unopened mail leaned in the corner. An unopened book sat face down on the arm of a chair, and everything seemed to carry the residue of waiting. The letter, however, did not wait. It trembled slightly in the faint draft from the window, as if impatient to be read, to unspool whatever chain of events it had been sent to set in motion. The moment it was opened, the air in the apartment shifted. Not dramatically, not like in stories where a single word changes everything in a rush, but subtly, the way a tide changes, slow and certain, pulling at the edges of the shore until the sand beneath your feet feels different. That IT spoke of a meeting, an old promise, buried beneath years of silence. It mentioned a place that no longer existed in quite the way it once had, and a time just days away. Nothing else. No explanation for why now, or why at all. And yet it was enough. Enough to stir a restlessness in a heart that had long since learned how to lie still. Beyond the walls of the apartment, the city kept its own rhythm. Restaurants filled with couples speaking over flickering candles, office towers glowed with the soft blue of late-night screens, and the rain kept falling in thin, silver threads. Life moved on in its ordinary patterns, unaware that in one quiet room, a decision had just been made, not with conviction, but with something far more dangerous. Curiosity. Curiosity was how it had all begun, once before. Years back, under an entirely different sky, when trust came as easily as breath and the world seemed to open with each new connection. It had been a time when words carried weight, but not yet the ache of consequence. That season had ended with a fracture so deep it could not be spoken about without loosening the ground beneath one's feet. And now, here it was again. The possibility of that same fracture reopening, or perhaps healing in a way neither could have imagined. The rain outside picked up, tapping steadily against the glass, the sound too measured to be a storm, but too insistent to be ignored. Somewhere, in that rhythm was an answer, one that would not be found here, in the safety of this still room. The letter lay on the table now, no longer trembling. Its message was simple, but its meaning felt vast. Something unfinished was waiting. And so, in the quiet between the rain and the hum of the city, the first threads of a long dormant story began to pull taut again, not yet loud, not yet visible to the world beyond these walls, but enough to draw someone back toward the place they had once sworn never to return. It is strange how a life can change without anyone noticing. How the smallest of invitations can reopen entire worlds. Years before the letter appeared, the life it reached had been built on a fragile kind of momentum, one that thrived on the illusion of permanence. Elise had been 24 when she first arrived in that coastal town, her suitcase carrying more conviction than clothes, her eyes fixed on a horizon she did not yet understand. The sea was the first thing she learned to love there, not for its beauty, but for its refusal to ever be still. The town itself was an in-between place, large enough to have its own rhythms and secrets, small enough that faces became familiar. In a matter of days, narrow streets sloped toward the harbor, where fishing boats swayed against their moorings, their wooden hulls weathered and dignified. Cafes spilled their tables onto sidewalks dusted with salt, and in the evenings, a warm, amber glow pooled beneath every window, as though the whole place existed inside a lantern. It was there, amid the routines of markets and tide schedules, that she had met Daniel. He had lived there his whole life, the kind of person who seemed stitched into the fabric of the place. He carried with him a quiet certainty, a way of speaking that made the ground feel steady beneath her. He was not the first to offer her kindness, but he was the first to make her believe in its endurance. Their lives wove together slowly. Days marked by errands run side by side, nights by long walks along the pier where the water reflected fractured constellations. There was no dramatic beginning, only an accumulation of moments that became something larger than either had planned. And for a while, it seemed unshakable. But permanence, she learned, is not built on the absence of storms. It is tested in the quiet aftermath, when words spoken in fear or pride refused to be taken back. The fracture between them had come without spectacle, no shouting, no grand betrayal. Instead, it arrived in small neglects, moments when one turned away rather than toward. A misunderstanding deepened by silence, and a silence deepened by time. By the end, they could no longer agree on what had been lost, only that it was gone. Elise, left in winter. She packed her belongings in the dim light of an early morning and boarded a train without a destination she could name aloud. She did not write, and Daniel did not call. For years, their lives existed as parallel lines, close enough to remember, far enough never to meet. The city she eventually chose offered her a different kind of anonymity. Here, the streets were wide, the buildings unapologetically tall, and the air carried the faint hum of constant motion. No one asked about the past unless it was offered, and she learned to keep hers folded neatly away. She built a life out of small routines, coffee in the same corner cafe, books borrowed from the library and returned unread, solitary walks at dusk when the world felt both intimate and unreachable. Yet, even in the safety of distance, there were reminders. A scent of salt in the air after rain, the flicker of a harbor scene in the window of a gallery, the low, steady voice of someone at the next table that made her chest tighten before she could stop herself. And now, the letter. Its arrival was as untraceable as the tide. No explanation, no hand she could picture holding the pen. But the place it named was clear, a small inn on the outskirts of the town they once shared, one that had always looked as though it were leaning slightly toward the sea. A meeting 2 days from now. She told herself it might be nothing, a coincidence, or perhaps someone else entirely. But the part of her that had remained watchful all these years, that had measured the distance between them in unspoken questions, knew better. The past was not returning to demand an apology, nor to offer one. It was coming back for something far more difficult, the truth of what had been left behind. The 2 days that followed were not filled with decision-making so much as a quiet surrender to inevitability. Elise did not pack with urgency. She folded her clothes slowly, paused often, and found herself staring out the window as if expecting the rain to stop and tell her not to go. But it didn't. It kept falling in that unbroken way it had for weeks, as if the whole city were caught in the same long exhale. She took the earliest train, not because she wanted to arrive sooner, but because waiting in her apartment felt like prolonging an ache. The journey south was a blur of gray sky and pale, wet fields. She didn't read or sleep, only traced the condensation on the window with her fingertips, a small act that reminded her of another winter, another trip, when she had been traveling towards something instead of back to by the time she reached the coast. The air had shifted. It was sharper here, the kind that stung lightly against the skin and carried the faint tang of salt. The town lay ahead, familiar yet altered in ways that unsettled her. A new shop where a bakery once stood, A mural on the side of a building she remembered as bare, but the streets still wound in the same patterns, pulling her unerringly toward. The harbor, the inn was just as she remembered, whitewashed walls dulled by weather, windows fogged from the warmth inside, and the faint smell of wood smoke drifting from its chimney. She checked in without asking if he had already arrived. Some part of her feared the answer. Another part feared that asking might give her away too soon. Her room faced the sea. From the small balcony, she could see the tide inching higher, pulling at the barnacled posts of the pier. The sound of the waves was constant, neither soothing nor harsh, only persistent. She stood there for a long while, her coat still on, until the cold began to seep into her hands. That evening, she walked the length of the harbor. Lights from the boats swayed on the black water, and the wind carried snippets of conversation from the tavern nearby. She half expected to turn a corner and see him there, unchanged, leaning against the railing as if no time had passed. But the streets were empty, and the silence between them remained intact. The first night passed without sight of him. She told herself she should leave, that this was a mistake, yet she stayed. The next morning brought no letter under the door. No knock. Only the same pale light filtering through the curtains. By the second night, the weight of absence began to feel heavier than the possibility of confrontation. She went to the small dining room downstairs, more to escape her thoughts than to eat. That was when she noticed the book, left on a chair near the fireplace, its cover worn in a way that made it impossible not to pick up. Inside, the name written on the first page stopped her. It was his handwriting. A flicker of something sharp passed through her. Recognition, yes, but also the sting of being seen without seeing him in return. The book was closed, set back down, but her pulse had already shifted. He was here, somewhere in this same building, in this same moment. The knowledge unsettled her more than she expected. It was not the fear of what they might say, but of what they might not. Years of silence had allowed each of them to imagine the other's story, to shape it into something that justified the distance. But now, those imagined versions were at risk of colliding with reality, and reality had never been as kind as memory. She returned to her room, unable to shake the thought that he might be just a hallway away. She imagined the sound of his steps, the slight drag of his left foot on uneven ground, a detail her mind had not erased despite everything else it had let go. Somewhere between midnight and morning, she realized the meeting was no longer about choice. It was about inevitability. And inevitability, she knew, had its own momentum, one she could neither slow nor turn away from now. The morning broke with a sky the color of unpolished steel. A thin fog hung low over the water, blurring the line between sea and sky until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Elise stood at the balcony rail, fingers curled tightly around the cold metal, and felt the air cling damp against her skin. Somewhere beneath that stillness, the tide was shifting, almost imperceptibly, yet with a force she could feel in her bones. She didn't hear his footsteps, not at first. It was the creak of the wooden boards outside her door that made her turn. By the time she opened it, the hallway was empty. Only a faint trace of cool air and the faintest scent of salt water remained. And yet, on the floor at her feet, a folded piece of paper waited. It was not an explanation, not even an apology, only a time and a place. The old pier, just before dusk. No name. But there didn't need to be one. The hours until then stretched long and slow, the kind that press on a person's chest. She walked the narrow streets, avoiding the parts of town she knew too well, but still finding herself passing the cafe where they once sat on rainy afternoons, the corner where she'd once waited for him after work. The memories came uninvited, not in order, not in clarity, but in the way a scent or a light in the window can summon a moment. By the time she reached the pier, the fog had begun to thin, leaving behind the glassy stillness of the sea. The boards beneath her feet were worn smooth by years of footsteps, some of them their own, long ago. She walked to the very end, where the horizon opened wide, and waited. When he appeared, it was without ceremony, no sudden voice, no deliberate approach, just the quiet outline of someone moving toward her through the fading light, his presence cutting through the space between them in a way that was both foreign and unbearably familiar. He stopped a few paces away, and for a moment, they simply stood there, the silence between them layered with years. Elise saw the changes first, the silver at his temples, the lines at the edges of his eyes, but beneath them was the same steadiness she had once trusted without question. He looked at her as though searching for something he couldn't yet name, and she realized she was doing the same. The wind lifted, carrying the scent of the sea between them. It was a fragile distance, easily closed with a step, yet neither moved. Words hovered unsaid, pressing at the edges of the moment. She felt the weight of every year they had spent apart, all the things left unspoken, and knew that whatever was said now would not undo them. It would only decide what would follow. When the first word came, it was quieter than she expected, almost uncertain, as though speaking it might make it vanish. And yet, it didn't. The sound stayed, settling between them like a marker in the sand. The rest followed, not rushed, not rehearsed, but with the raw precision of truths long carried and finally set down. Somewhere in the telling, her voice faltered, but he did not turn away. His gaze held hers, steady as the tide, and when he spoke, his words carried the same unvarnished honesty. They spoke not to repair what was gone, but to understand it, to place the past where it belonged, without letting it dictate the shape of what might remain. The sun dipped lower, the horizon burning with muted gold before sinking into gray. By the time they fell silent, the air between them felt changed, not cleared entirely, but lighter, as though they had both set down something neither could have carried alone much longer. She realized, standing there with the boards creaking gently beneath them, that this meeting was not an ending, nor a return to what had been. It was a threshold, and thresholds, she knew, could lead in more than one direction. They walked back along the pier without touching, the rhythm of their steps carrying an unspoken understanding. The town had grown quieter in the evening air. Shopkeepers pulled in displays. Lamps in windows burned soft in gold, and the faint clink of cutlery from the taverns spilled into the street. It was the same place, and yet not. Much like the two of them at the edge of the harbor, they paused. The water below shifted in slow, deliberate movements, as though it, too, had been listening. Elise glanced toward the path that led to the inn, expecting him to turn that way, but he didn't. Instead, he looked out over the darkening water, his face unreadable in the dim light. She understood then that whatever had just been exchanged was complete. There would be no lingering in the way people sometimes do when they are unsure whether to hold on or let go. She left him there and walked the narrow streets alone, her thoughts a mix of relief and an ache she could not yet name. It wasn't the ache of loss. She had already lost him years ago, but something else, something tied to the recognition that closure does not always arrive in the shape you expect. Sometimes it is not clean or final. Sometimes it leaves a thread hanging, one you may never choose to pull again. Back in her room, she lit the single lamp on the desk and sat by the window. The tide had risen fully, erasing the sandbars she'd seen that morning. The pier stretched out into the dark like a thin line of memory, fragile and stubborn. She thought about the words they had shared and the ones they had not. There were moments when she'd felt the urge to ask more, to dig into the spaces between his sentences, but she had resisted. Not everything needed to be known in order to be understood. The hours passed quietly. She packed her bag, folding each item with care, aware that she would leave in the morning. She wasn't leaving to escape. The urgency she had carried with her was gone. What remained was a kind of stillness, the kind that comes after a long, unbroken rain. When she finally lay down, she listened to the faint groan of the building in the wind, the muted crash of waves against the rocks below. There was no certainty about whether she would ever return here or whether their paths would cross again. But there was a certainty of another kind, one that came from having met the past on its own ground and having walked away without the weight of what-ifs pressing at her back. The morning was clear when she woke, the fog burned away by a pale sun that spilled across the harbor. For the first time since arriving, the sea looked open rather than closed, its surface rippling in slow, deliberate patterns that caught the light. Elise stood for a while at the window, her bag already zipped and resting by the door, letting her gaze trace the water's edge until it met the horizon. When she stepped outside, the air was sharp and clean, as if the night's tide had carried something away. The streets were quiet at this hour. Only a few fishermen moved along the docks, their voices low, their boots leaving damp prints on the worn boards. She walked without hurry, the path to the station familiar enough that she didn't need to think about the edge of the pier. She slowed. The boards still bore the faint dampness of the morning, the same creak underfoot, the same smell of salt and wood. She imagined him here again, standing in the same place they had met the day before, but the image didn't pull at her the way it might have once. It felt instead like a photograph she could tuck away, still vivid, still part of her, but no longer urgent. The train ride back carried none of the tension of her arrival. She watched the coastline recede, the town shrinking into a blur of muted colors and shapes. The water stretched wide behind it, endless and unbroken, as though the place had folded itself neatly back into her memory. She thought of the years they had spent apart, the distance filled with assumptions, with imagined truths, and how easily all of it could have remained that way. And yet, she had gone back. She had stood on that pier, looked him in the eye, and heard his voice again. She had not left with answers to every question, perhaps not even to the most important ones, but she had left with something steadier. The knowledge that the past no longer had the power to shape the way she walked forward. By the time the train pulled into the city, the day had settled into a soft light. The streets were as she had left them, hurried footsteps, the hum of traffic, the small comforts of anonymity. And yet, as she stepped onto the platform, she felt different in ways that didn't need naming. Some stories do not end with a return to what once was, nor with a clean severing. Some end with a quiet shift, subtle but unshakable, that makes it impossible to see the road ahead in quite the same way. For Elise, this was enough. The letter had brought her back to a place she had once sworn to avoid, but it had also carried her across a threshold she hadn't known she was still standing before. She walked away now without the pull of the tide at her back, and without the weight of unfinished things in her hands. Sometimes, the only closure you get is the understanding that you can move forward without it. And sometimes, that is the truest kind of ending, the end